Hello, beautiful community. I am truly sorry for this extraordinary technical cock-up. Let me know if you can see and hear me now. I'll briefly tell you what I think has happened. And then I have managed in this time to actually print out some of the questions that I noticed in the previous stream. Fantastic. Beautiful. It's so lovely to have you. Just a little bit about the extraordinary delay. It's a failure in software in an app that I use because I'm using my smartphone as my camera, and it's that app that's failing to recognize a microphone that I actually checked and plugged in a few minutes before the live. So next time we're going to have to make sure that I go live a few times just to test. And of course, I managed to recreate a semi-lying down position here for me in the room next door. And that's why it took me a little bit extra, because I'm not quite a sitting up philosopher at the moment. I am a horizontal philosopher. Now, I have some questions that I've noticed that I actually think a lot of you want to ask, and then a few questions are more particular that I'll race through more quickly. So Andy asks a question that I think a lot of you probably are curious about. I'm going to have a little go at it. I'm going to be slower than usual. This is a first live in a couple of months, and this is a little bit of a health bungee jump act for me. I've just taken a little bit of oxygen before this, so hopefully I'll have enough to deliver value and wisdom. Andy, hi Andy, is asking, during your talk with Mark Galeotti, by the way, obviously take a peek at it if you haven't, there were a number of points on which you seem to diverge. Could you kindly compare and contrast them? Well, Mark's disagreements with me are obviously, hi Andy, are obviously not philosophical. But of philosophical disagreement, I often like to say that the most fruitful disagreement is disagreement where, oh my God, it's so much easier to semi-lie down, by the way. Can't tell you the joys of chronic illness. In philosophy, we often say that the most fruitful disagreements are disagreements where you can't tell exactly where you diverge. So that means that they are fruitful, because if you can exactly map out where the difference is, then it's boring. You can just recreate the other person in your own head, and you don't need them if you know exactly the ins and outs of the disagreement. So fruitful disagreement is always necessarily mysterious. It's a feeling of saying, okay, we have diverged, but who took a turn and when that diverged? Did both of us take some turns? What were they? Were they these little tracks that are going off the motorway? Were they big side roads that we took? How did we end up here? And of course, just exchanging around these differences can be fruitful in illuminating how you see the situation, how you see your own position, even if neither party remotely changes their mind. So I wonder what these divergences are. I mean, I probably see a little bit more discontinuity in Putin's regime than Mark does over the last 15 years. Obviously, Mark thinks there's a lot of discontinuity. I think there is even more. In other words, I think the degree to which I think the regime has radicalized may go even further in my interpretation and in that of some others. That also goes for an element of mysticism with an apocalyptic twist that I never want to overestimate, that I do attribute to the Kremlin. I think Mark is skeptical about that. We obviously diverge a bit on the plausibility of Putin challenging Article 5. Frenzel, hello. And I think that paradoxically, there's actually an agreement there within the divergence. And that's that even though I think that Putin challenging Article 5 is more plausible than Mark thinks it is, we both attribute to Putin an imperial picture of how NATO works. Mark thinks Putin is perhaps less likely to challenge Article 5 because he knows in his mind, that's his assessment, Putin's assessment, that NATO is just a projection of US imperialism. So, of course, the other countries will just fall in line. There's going to be no question for Spain about whether it wants to defend the Baltics, because America will just tell it to. And I share that view of Putin's view, that he sees NATO as US imperial domination of Europe, really. But I take that in a slightly different direction because I think that Putin is anticipating a moment where the United States will not want to defend Article 5 in Eastern Europe. Then questions of military expertise arise, and here it's very important to stay out of it for me. That's to say, I can give views about Putin's conceptions of the West, Putin's sense of the existential qualities of his conflict with the West, but I can't map any military scenarios. That's outside of my realm of expertise. And of course, that raises a challenge because one of Mark's points would be from a technical point of view, I am skeptical about the feasibility of Putin doing something in the Baltics. Like, what is he going to do exactly in the Baltics? Give me that picture and give it to me technically and militarily. Another thing that we diverge on a bit, but not that much, is how deeply Putin is in to this story of Western decline and demise. And I think we share that story, but maybe I'm a bit more alarmist and a bit more radical in how I attribute it to Putin. That's to say that I am closer, I'm not quite there necessarily, but I'm closer to the idea that Putin expects an inexorable Western collapse than Mark is, perhaps. So I think this is just the beginning of some of the differences. But I think what's interesting is that it is rare to encounter folks who offer expertise on the issue of Putin's war, who don't share what Mark and I obviously do share, and that is that it's an existential war for Putin, it's a defensive war for Putin, and it's a war for Putin against all of the West. So that's a little bit of comment on the differences. There are some differences in the radicalization attributed to the Putin regime, and there are some differences in the attribution of a conception to the West, or a conception of the West to Putin. And there may even be a slight difference in how I see Western decline, right? I might be, Mark may be a bit more optimistic about this than I am. So that's a very incomplete and partial map, and a very fruitful one. Jochen is asking, what are your sources for the interpretation of what is going on in Putin's head? It's telepathy. Are they all publicly available? Is it Russian content? How much time do you spend on it? So I think that's a very important extension of the first question. I think some of you are interested in this for sure. So let me try a little bit. Now, the first thing to say is that in the most immediate sense, I am a moral and political philosopher, and then a public intellectual. Mark very kindly said on Twitter that I'm one of the most thoughtful Russia commentators. And I accept that tag. But I don't accept it in the first instance because I don't see myself as a country expert. I see myself as a public intellectual who is commenting on politics and who absolutely comments on some regions, but not on others. And who absolutely comments on some patterns of global politics, but not on others. And I think that's an important difference, even though exactly how you draw that boundary is a matter of, if you like, your ethical intuition about what it means to responsibly stay in your lane. And funnily enough, the next video with Mark will be about activism and expertise and the gamification of war. So, and I don't know if that'll go in the main channel or here. It was planned for the main channel, but the main channel seems to be really struggling badly at the moment. And I don't know if that's my illness-induced absence or also a little bit the unfortunate bug that affects some YouTube channels called invalid traffic, something we can't do anything about. But that makes YouTube unhappy about some channels in a way that could affect their views. Because Mark and our video really plonked in the algorithm badly. Now, so that's the first thing. I'd give a bit of categorization there. The second thing I would say is that I am not in any way a journalist. That's to say, I have in my life some people very close to me who are professional journalists. They have sources. They cultivate sources. They meet people. They meet world leaders. I don't meet world leaders. I don't have sources, or at least I don't cultivate sources. And so that's a very important difference. So for instance, Mark, in a research capacity and in an expert capacity, will have networks of people to ask, what do you think is happening there? What do you think is happening there? Can you tell me something I'm not seeing because you're closer? And I intentionally do not cultivate that. The exceptions are that, sure, sometimes if I make a video for the main channel and I'm looking at something that's an expression of academic expertise, I might email the academic and say, what do you think about this research that I might include in my video? Am I understanding it correctly? And what do you think it says? What do you think it doesn't say? I've certainly done that in the past. And I can talk to people who are talking to people, right? So I could read something in the foreign policy and I could email or text the person written that, hey, you said that, where'd you get it from? Do you have any reliable way to back it up? And what's your sense of it? Do you want to share a little? I can do that, but I do not cultivate a kind of network of sources because I do not operate in that way like an expert, in that kind of in that kind of mode. I'll perhaps say more about these distinctions later, and I'll be just brief here. So what's going on there for me? What do I have? I obviously have a rich sense of humans doing politics that comes through my political philosophy background. And then I also have, in the case of Russia, a bit of a sense of the country's history, a history of making notes and reflecting on the Putin regime from the 90s. I mean, you can see from the way I talk about it, I didn't start thinking about it in 2022 or even in 2014. And you can tell, right? You can immediately sense what difference that makes, right? I have had systematic conversations, certainly with Russia experts and international relations folks, historian folks for 20, 25 years about the Putin regime. Um, I remember a wonderful conversation I had with Adam Roberts, who did a bit of a debunk of John Mearsheimer, Professor Emeritus Adam Roberts, who is an important um, uh, scholar. And we were talking about analogies and disanalogies between particular Tsars and Putin right at the beginning of Putin's reign. So this has been an ongoing process for me. So that's another thing. Then, of course, there is the language and the cultural understanding. And then a question arises, well, how do you interpret somebody who's a political leader? How do you make sense of them, whether it's Biden or Putin or Xi or anybody? And I think there certainly you need a multidisciplinariness of intuitive and analytical skill. You need to have a sense of how power corrupts people. Talking to journalists who worked in dictatorships helps. Reading about human psychology helps. You certainly need an intuitive picture of somebody's personality, and quite frankly and bluntly, that just comes from emotional intelligence. So I can look at Liz Truss and see what it's like to be Liz Truss. I can look at Hillary Clinton and see what it's like to be Hillary Clinton. And that's just a matter of emotional intelligence, intuition, and insight. And you can be wrong about that. You can have more of it, less of it, and so on. I'm also, of course, conscious of the isolation of figures like Putin. And the expert community has very much felt that over the last 4 years, that access to what's going on with Putin is harder to come by because his circle has shrunk so much. And so experts can't ask somebody who can ask somebody what Putin is up to the way they could 5-6 years ago. It obviously also requires refreshment. So you've got to check in with the guy. Well, what's happening to him now compared with 6 months ago? Does it look any different? But you've also got to understand that this is a guy who is a professional actor, who uses speech just as political technology. And you have to have the humility to appreciate how much depends on the whims of a single individual here, which, are only unbuttoned in very narrow circles that we can't access. So you absolutely need a degree of humility here. And you can be confident about certain things, but you can't be confident about others. I mean, I can be confident that Putin is uncomfortable or stressed during a certain speech he makes, but I need to be humble about not extrapolating too much from that. So that's the beginning of an answer, all of these tiny points all over the place. But the real point is that you've got to re-ask all of these questions I've just asked constantly, so that you stay responsible to your community, to your readers, to your viewers. Because what you don't want to do is be on the ball in 2024, but lose touch, and by 2025 just keep reciting the same points. If reality has changed a bit, right? If Putin has degenerated a bit, right? And slightly different things are true of him now than were true before. So you've got to evolve, and you've also got to always question, right? Your epistemic credibility in respect of each of the things I've said. So I think that's the beginning of a conversation. And that's why you see this ethical business of staying in your lane is a difficult business and takes a lot of responsibility. More on that later. Sorry, this was slow. I am doing my best to hurry my brain up. Man mad. I wonder if you saw the latest Putin interview. My assessment is that Putin is willing to accept any NATO-like guarantees for Ukraine, but just not call it NATO, not to lose face. No, that's not true in my interpretation, going back to everything we've said over the last 10 minutes. Could Putin non-catastrophically accept NATO-like security guarantees for Ukraine, short of NATO itself, in principle? Let's say such a thing is possible, that Ukraine can get security guarantees as strong as Article 5, or as weak as Article 5, and they can get that without NATO membership. Could Putin accept that non-catastrophically, that's to say without regime collapse in Russia? Or is it something so bad that it will inevitably lead to regime collapse for Putin? No, it won't necessarily lead to regime collapse. So in principle, could Putin accept what you're putting on the table without having to resort to extreme measures or panic because he thinks it'll collapse his regime? Yeah, I think the answer to that is probably yes. But if I were advising Putin now as an evil Putin advisor, because my main channel has been affected by the invalid traffic bug, so I gotta now get a job, work for Putin. Well, if I were really evil and I were advising Putin, I would say you'd be out of your mind to accept that now. And I would need to persuade Putin he thinks that. I mean, very roughly speaking, Putin thinks that it's a difficult situation, but that on balance, he's winning the war against the West in Ukraine. On balance. Do I think that he could be wrong about that? Yes, I do. Do I think that saying that while it's such a difficult judgment to make, and it's a terribly ambiguous and vague judgment to espouse as well, because it needs to be filled out, what do you mean winning? But could a responsible expert in the West who wants Putin to be defeated say that on balance we're closer to losing than winning in October 2024? Yeah, I think that wouldn't be an unreasonable claim, unfortunately. So Putin is nowhere near being in a situation in which it would be reasonable for him to accept Ukraine NATO membership or Ukraine membership of something equivalent to NATO. So the answer is he could get there if things go really badly for him, but things are not going really badly for him. They're going badly in some ways, but they're going okay in other ways. So he's a million miles away from either being open to this as a matter of biographical fact or from rationally needing to be open to this. So Putin's answer to this is, I'm in a much stronger position than your NATO proposal implies. It would take a much more serious set of prohibitive impacts imposed on Putin, which aren't being imposed now by the West, for him to get to a position where he's going to have to agree to that. So that's my answer. Man Mad is also asking, and I'll answer this very quickly, I wonder about your statement that Ukraine can't accept giving up territory. What is this statement based on? So I didn't say that Ukraine can't give up territory. Ukraine is on course to give up a lot of territory as we stand, right? Unless something catastrophic happens in Russia, Ukraine is on course either for a very long war or for giving up a lot of territory. What I am saying is that Ukraine cannot accept that that territory isn't rightfully Ukrainian. You see the difference. So what I'm saying is that it's politically maybe possible, although Ukrainians don't fancy that now, but it's maybe possible for Ukraine to say, this is ours, but we agree that de facto Russia owns it now, And we agree that though it's ours, we won't try to regain it by military means. That is potentially something Ukrainian government could get away with domestically. But domestically, Ukrainian government couldn't get away with saying, we accept that this territory is legitimately Russian now. Right? So there are certain ways in which Ukraine, for political reasons, cannot formalize that concession while potentially needing to make that concession in practice. And so we have this bizarre divergence whereby Ukraine still wants and quarter believes in territorial liberation. The West has forgotten about territorial liberation and just says, let's split this country up. Russia can have some of it, Ukraine can have the rest of it, and Ukraine will be given security guarantees, hopefully, or will be strong enough, hopefully, to be safe from future Russian invasion. That's the Western picture. And the Russian picture is, we'll keep the territory, please. Thank you very much. And we'll have a non-allied, non-security guarantee protected, and partly demilitarized Ukraine as well. So the West wants two strong blocks to stand next to each other and guarantee that the Ukrainian bloc is strong enough to disincentivize a future Russian invasion. Ukraine wants not that, but territorial liberation. And Russia wants not that, but a strong bloc on the Russian side, a very weak bloc on the Ukrainian side that can be progressively vulnerable to political exploitation. Corinne is saying, suppose Ukraine keeps its sovereignty and is at peace in 2030. Is there a chance that Russia goes to war in Central Asia? Does regime security depend on war in general, or specifically on war in Eastern Europe? I think the simple answer here is that Putin is in an existential war against the West. What Putin is after is not Ukrainian territory, but a transformation of the global order into a kind of shape that he would find agreeable. And even that shape he would still then traduce and violate. That's an ask or a demand or a pressure on the West, right? So the entire enterprise is Western-centric here. It's about evicting a certain semblance of a dying global order, as Putin sees it, that probably is going to die anyway, but needs a few nudges on the way out.